There are prisons built to confine the body, but there are also places designed to kill hope. Alcatraz was one of those places, cold, isolated, and offering absolutely no way out. And yet, on a night in 1962, 3 inmates shocked the entire nation when they escaped from what was believed to be an impenetrable fortress. No one knows where they went, whether they died in the darkness or are still living in the light, hidden in plain sight. And what makes this story so haunting isn't just that they vanished. It's that no one can say for certain whether they ever left. So fasten your seatbelt as we dive into today's mystery. But first, you'll have incredible luck if you like and subscribe before this video ends. When it comes to the most daring prison escapes in the history of the United States, very few places stir the public's imagination quite like Alcatraz, a prison built on a remote island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. This island, with an area of just 0.08 square kilometers, was once dubbed the Massive Rock in the Sea, a place from which no inmate could ever escape. Surrounding the island are sheer cliffs with no exit routes, and the waters around it are both deep and chillingly cold. There are virtually no sandy shores or places to grab onto. The distance from the island to the nearest coastline is 2.4 kilometers, but what made it the perfect location for a prison was not that distance, but rather the unforgiving combination of nature and human design. Originally, Alcatraz was not built to be a prison. It was first constructed as a military outpost, but everything changed after the devastating 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. When the city's prison was destroyed by the earthquake and ensuing fires, the authorities were forced to urgently evacuate the most dangerous inmates to the island. And when the first 176 prisoners were brought to Alcatraz, they had no idea that they were stepping onto a land from which no one ever returned. In 1912, the federal government began building a fortified prison on the island, and from that point forward, its name changed to the one the world would never forget: the Devil's Island. During the dark and desperate years of the Great Depression in the 1930s, as America plunged into economic chaos and widespread despair, criminal organizations began to quietly rise across its major cities. Armed with modern weapons, driven by insatiable greed, and bound together by ruthless loyalty, these underworld gangs spread fear from Chicago to New York. And in a time when the legal system seemed powerless against the surge of violence, the federal government realized it needed a place to confine those who could not be controlled, a place where no amount of power, wealth, or connections could orchestrate a rescue. Alcatraz was chosen not just for its isolation, but because it was virtually unreachable from the outside. The criminals that America feared the most were sent there, men whose names carried infamy, like Alphonse Gabriel Capone, better known by his notorious alias, Scarface. But at Alcatraz, Capone was no longer a kingpin. He was just another inmate with a number. There were no secret phone lines. No boats could brave the wind-whipped waters to whisk him away in the dead of night. And he wasn't alone. Nearly every name on the list of repeat escapees, feared gang leaders, and cold-blooded gunmen in American criminal history found their way to the island. But because the inmate roster was so exceptional, Alcatraz quickly became a gathering place for some of the most brilliant escape minds in the world, men who had once made mainland prisons bow in defeat. And so, when individuals like that were locked up together on a single island, meticulous escape plans began to take shape. It may sound paradoxical, but behind the cold walls, steel fences, and gun towers of Alcatraz Island, many inmates considered it the most livable place in the entire federal prison system at the time. Not because of freedom, but because of the absolute safety found within its strict confines. Alcatraz typically housed only about 250 to 300 inmates out of a total 600 available cells, meaning the prison was never overcrowded, and that meant each inmate was given their own private cell. For many prisoners who had endured threats from cellmates in other prisons, this separation offered a tremendous sense of relief. Being alone between four walls is still better than sleeping next to someone who'd stab you over a piece of bread, one inmate wrote in his memoirs about his years of confinement on the island. Beyond that, living conditions at Alcatraz were surprisingly different. The meals here were considered unusually good by prison standards. The food wasn't just sufficient in quantity, it was required to meet nutritional standards as well, Menus included meat, vegetables, and even dessert, as long as the inmate followed the rules. And if they demonstrated good behavior, their reward came in the form of access to a library with more than 15,000 books, musical instruments for those who could play, paintbrushes and colors for anyone with artistic talent, and, perhaps most unusual of all, a monthly film screening inside the prison's miniature theater. For all these reasons, Alcatraz was not only the final destination for the most dangerous men, but it also became the place many inmates hoped to be transferred to. They were willing to accept absolute isolation, as long as it meant escaping the chaos and living quietly, day by day, in a cell of their own. If there was one thing that Alcatraz never lacked, it was barriers. This prison was designed to lock down every possible escape, not only physically, but also mentally. And for more than 2 decades of operation, that seemed like an undeniable fact. But like any law that appears unbreakable, there are always those who seem born just to challenge it. 3 inmates, Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin, were names that didn't leave much of an impression on the public at the time, but would keep American authorities sleepless for decades afterward. Frank Morris was a loner, but his intelligence was frightening. Abandoned by his parents as a child, he grew up in orphanages and spent nearly all his youth going in and out of juvenile detention. But unlike many reckless criminals, Morris had a mind for strategy and a cold, deliberate patience. When the authorities measured inmates' IQ scores, Morris registered at 133, a number no one expected to belong to a man who had robbed banks and successfully escaped prison multiple times. The Anglin brothers, on the other hand, were a different story. Born into a poor farming family in rural Georgia, they left the fields behind early and turned to crime. But what made them remarkable wasn't their criminal record, but their exceptional physical condition. Growing up near rivers and streams, they could swim like fish and had already escaped other prisons by swimming across freezing waters. Frank, John, and Clarence met in prison, and together they crafted the blueprint of a perfect escape. There was one more man once part of the plan, Allen West, an inmate with a history of escape attempts who was housed in the same cell block. In December 1961, all 4 began working on what seemed impossible, an escape from Alcatraz. None of them saw the walls as barriers. They saw them as materials for escape. None of them saw the sea as a threat. They saw it as a path. And every night, as the wind whistled through the icy cracks in the wall, they quietly listened to the guards' footsteps, memorized patrol times, studied the smallest details of every brick, every ventilation duct, every element that would seem meaningless to a typical prisoner. Escaping from Alcatraz could never be a spur-of-the-moment decision. It wasn't the story of a few impulsive minutes or a single reckless night. If one hoped to survive the sheer cliffs, the freezing water, and the heavy layers of security, then every smallest detail had to be calculated, every move concealed in silence. And indeed, what made the 1962 escape plan legendary wasn't luck. It was an extraordinary level of patience and intelligence. Frank Morris, the ringleader of the plan, together with the Anglin brothers and Allen West, spent over 6 months preparing in secret. But what was truly astonishing wasn't just the amount of time they spent. It was the materials they used. Their weapons weren't guns, weren't sledgehammers, and certainly weren't explosives. They used glue, soap, toothpaste, toilet paper, raincoats, musical instruments, and an old vacuum cleaner. From dozens of standard-issue raincoats handed out in prison, they carefully cut each piece, heated the corners to fuse them using homemade glue, and created an inflatable raft large enough to hold 3 grown men. No one suspected a thing when they asked for more raincoats, because they had always presented themselves as model inmates, musicians in the regular group activities. Frank, who frequently visited the library, happened to read an article in a survival magazine saying that raincoats could be used as flotation devices in emergency situations at sea. That was the first spark of the plan. From there, they built life vests, waterproof pouches for personal items, and paddles from scrap wood, all handmade. But there was one critical question. How would they get out of their cells? The 4 men were each housed in separate cells, and the walls were all reinforced concrete. Digging with spoons was impossible, but West, who had once worked in the kitchen, secretly removed the motor from a vacuum cleaner, and with it, the group began building a makeshift electric drill by wiring it to the room's power source. Each night, while the other prisoners slept, they took turns widening the ventilation holes beneath their sinks, holes that led into a hidden utility corridor beneath the prison. But the biggest challenge was the sound. The noise of drilling could get them caught. And to solve that problem, they came up with a clever solution: play music to mask the sound. As model inmates, they had been given musical instruments, and each night, during the scheduled recreation hour, they would strum guitars and blow horns. When the entire cell block was filled with music, that was the moment the drill came alive. For an escape plan so large in scale and meticulous in its preparation, the final details would be the true test of both finesse and endurance for those executing it. And for Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers, they knew one thing: success didn't only depend on breaking out, it also depended on delaying discovery for as long as possible. In a place where even being absent from your cell for 1 hour was enough to trigger alarms across the island, they needed to create the illusion that no one had escaped, at least until dawn. Their solution was to fake their own presence, making use of anything available inside their cells: soap, toilet paper, hair collected from the barber shop, toothpaste, even broken bits of cement. They crafted dummy heads. These heads had clearly defined facial features, painted with skin tone color using pigments extracted from art kits, which one of them had received as a reward for good behavior. Each strand of hair was glued carefully to the scalp. Every stroke of paint was dotted precisely onto the forehead, the cheeks, and the eyelids. They knew that as long as the guard passing by took just a quick glance, the dummy head wouldn't raise any suspicion. And then, when everything was finally ready, the night of June 11th, 1962, became the moment they had waited so long for. Close to midnight, they quietly slipped through the vent holes, crawled along the narrow maintenance corridor behind the cell block, and made their way to the end, where a stairwell led straight up to the roof. From there, they crossed over the kitchen roof, then followed a vent pipe down to the interior courtyard. In their hands were bundles containing the folded raft, homemade paddles, and life vests fashioned from raincoats. As for Alan West, the fourth member of the plan, he became the unfinished chapter in an otherwise flawless escape. Days before the breakout, out of fear of being caught, West had sealed his vent hole back up with cement. But on the night of the escape, that layer had already hardened. Though he tried his best to chip it away with his bare hands, he couldn't break through in time before the other three were gone. And so, when dawn broke, West was still in his cell. The next morning, when prison staff came for roll call as usual, everything was already in motion. The alarm began to blare uncontrollably. At that moment, Alcatraz was no longer an impenetrable fortress. It had become the scene of the most peculiar, calculated, and mysterious prison escape in American history. Within just a few hours, a massive search operation was launched across the San Francisco Bay. Patrol boats circled the island, helicopters flew low, scanning every ripple, every floating piece of debris. Local radio stations broadcast emergency bulletins non-stop, accompanied by images of the 3 inmates now wanted nationwide. But the very perfection of the plan was what pushed the manhunt into a deadlock. After 10 days combing every inch of the water, the search teams recovered only a few clues. A drifting paddle, confirmed to be identical to the handmade designs left behind in their cells. A life vest made from raincoats, still fully intact. And most notably, a waterproof pouch containing family photos, handwritten notes, and even contact addresses, all belonging to the Anglin brothers. And then, as with every great mystery, theories began to emerge. Some believed the raft had fallen apart as they attempted to flee. Others thought they had been attacked by sharks, since these waters are known hunting grounds for great whites. But there was one thing no one could explain. If they truly died, where were their bodies? Drowned victims usually wash ashore after a few days, but throughout the entire search, not a single body was found. As for Alan West, the only member of the group who didn't make it out, he quickly cooperated with the authorities. He recounted the entire plan, every detail, every step. But the most important question, are they still alive, was the one that even West couldn't answer. In 2013, a strange handwritten letter was sent to the San Francisco Police Department. It was written in shaky handwriting and signed with the name John Anglin. In the letter, the writer claimed, We made it out successfully. Me, Frank, and Clarence. Frank died in 2005. Clarence passed 2 years later. Now only I remain. I have cancer. If you agree to get me medical treatment, I'm ready to turn myself in, but I want no more than 1 year in prison. The letter left the police puzzled. They couldn't verify the sender's identity. The fingerprints were unclear. There was no envelope, no postmark. Some believed it was a cruel hoax, but others insisted there's something strangely genuine in the way he wrote. The story became even stranger when a direct nephew of the Anglin brothers publicly claimed that he had long known the two were still alive, that all three men had once lived together in South America, specifically in a remote rural region of Brazil. He provided a photograph taken in 1975, showing two salt and pepper-haired men standing side by side in a sugarcane field, both of whom bore a striking resemblance to age-progressed sketches of John and Clarence Anglin in middle age. The photo was submitted to a team of forensic analysts. They used facial recognition technology, compared bone structure, ear shape, and eye position, and concluded that it was highly likely the two men in the image were indeed the Anglin brothers. It didn't stop there. The mother of this man, who was also the biological sister of John and Clarence, confirmed something remarkable. For decades after the escape, every Christmas, their family would receive a card with no postmark, no return address, and written in the familiar handwriting of the two brothers she had known better than anyone else. Then, when an internal FBI file was declassified, the public learned that as early as 1965, just 3 years after the escape, the US government had already suspected that all three men had fled to Brazil. Since 2013, after the strange letter came to light, the San Francisco Police Department and the FBI have reopened the case. One notable fact is that, under US federal law, an investigation into a prison escape remains open until all suspects are confirmed deceased, or until the year they turn 99. This means that, at present, John and Clarence Anglin may be around 93 or 94 years old, and Frank Morris, if he's still alive, would be nearing 97, which means there are still about 3 to 5 years left before their file is officially closed. From time to time, someone sends in a photo of a homeless man somewhere in Florida, or an elderly farmer in a quiet Brazilian village, and asks the same question. Could it be one of them? And while most of these leads don't produce breakthroughs, they prove one thing. This story has never left the public's imagination. Maybe you don't believe that those three men actually made it across the water. Maybe, for you, Alcatraz will always be a place no one could ever escape from. But if this story made you pause, even for a moment, to think, then share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to keep exploring mysteries that remain unsolved, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. See you in the next video.